And now for the grand conclusion of Lehi in the Desert and the World of the Jaredites. We're going to clear out the appendix, which hopefully if we didn't clear out the appendix, it might swell up and burst, and then we'd have to remove the appendix, and that I just don't think we could do that to an old book like this. Appendix 1, East Coast or West Coast? Oh, we're going to get some interesting ideas. All right. Whether the Jaredites crossed the Atlantic or the Pacific is not fundamental to the thesis of their Asiatic origin. I'd agree. Since in either case their culture was fully developed at the time they left their homeland, President Milton R. Hunter has kindly called the writer's attention to certain statements in the writings of Ixtlilxochitl and Sahagun that seem to cast light on the subject of the Jaredite landing. The pertinent passages as given in Hunter and Ferguson, Ancient America and the Book of Mormon, see Koa Book Company, Oakland, California, 1950, are as follows. Quote, Sahagun's comment on the remarks of Ixtlilxochitl. It is the common and general opinion of all the natives of this Chichimeca land that their ancestors came from occidental parts, and all of them are now called Toltecas, Achulas, Mexicanos, and other nations that are in this land say that they are of the lineage of Chichimecas and are proud of it. And the reason is, according as it appears in their histories, that the first king they had was called Chichimectl, who was the one who brought them to this new world where they settled, who, as can be inferred, came from the Great Tartary, and they were those of the division of Babylon. And they say that they traveled for 104 years through different parts of the world until they arrived at Huehue Tlaplan, their country. That's on page 25. Sahagun further says, page 30, concerning the origin of these peoples, the report of the old men of central Mexico, where the Sahagun lived many years, gives is that they came by the sea from the north, i.e. down the Gulf Coast of Mexico. It is conjectured that they came from 7 caves, and that these 7 caves are the 7 ships or galleys in which the first settlers of this land came. The people first came to settle this coast. The people first came to settle this land from the direction of Florida and came coasting along the coast, disembarking in the port of Panuco, which they call Panco, which means place where those arrived who crossed the water. This people came in search of the terrestrial paradise, and they had as a family name Tamoanchan, which means we are looking for our home. And again, page 38. And this king, as he traveled on with them through the greater part of the world, arrived in this land. Okay, so now his narrative. Here, 2 distinct phases of the Jaredite migration are indicated. One, there is the original exodus of the ancestors from occidental parts under their first chief, Chichimectl, who was the one who brought them to this new world where they settled, who came from the Great Tartary, and they were those of the division of Babylon. Tartary is defined in the Oxford Dictionary as the region of Central Asia extending eastward from the Caspian Sea. Okay. The very area to which we have assigned our Jaredite wanderings in the Old World. When Sahagun, writing in Mexico in the 16th century, speaks of occidental parts, he means regions to the west. In those days, the word Occident, was used in its literal sense, and Jesuit missionaries writing their reports from Mexico in the time of Sahagun refer to Asia as the Occident, since it was Asia and not Europe that lay to the west of them. The writer was puzzled when, in an early and premature attempt to translate certain Jesuit letters, he first came upon this natural but unfamiliar use of the word Occident. Sahagun removes all ambiguity on the subject by specifically mentioning Babylon and the Great Tartary, neither of which was Occidental in the European sense, as the very Occidental parts from which the settlers came. Then there is a second landing, that of the people who reached Huehue Tlapalan after 104 years of wandering. These people, specifically described as the first settlers of Mexico, came from the north, coasting along the Gulf of Mexico, from the direction of Florida. We are not told where they came from, nor are we told that they had just crossed the ocean, but we are told that they landed in Mexico over a century after the Great Migration began, i.e., long after the Jaredites had arrived in the New World. Moreover, a moment's reflection will make it apparent that the landing at Panko can hardly have been the original Jaredite debarkation. After 344 terrible days at sea, the Jaredites, or anyone else, would waste no time in stepping ashore on the first land that offered. Indeed, it is clearly implied in Ether 612 that they did just that and only later continued their expansion and exploration, Ether 7.4. But the Panko people came coasting along the coast, sailing perhaps for many days, in full sight of land. Either they had not been at sea very long, or they had already landed somewhere else in their dire need for fresh meat, fresh water, and fresh fruit. They would have landed immediately instead of coasting along the coast. Had they sailed into the Gulf from the Atlantic, they could hardly have avoided sighting islands and touching at them. There is no mention of any terrible storm that might have kept them from landing, and at any rate, people do not coast along the coast in terrible storms. The statements that they come from the north and from the direction of Florida are strangely localized. If Panko people had just crossed the ocean, they certainly would have known it, and it would have been the main part of their legend, but no Atlantic crossing is mentioned. The landing in Mexico is obviously one of the later developments of the Great Jaredite Migration, which, as we have often noted, did not come to an end with their landing in the New World, but continued in many directions. We know that the Jaredites in their wanderings crossed many bodies of waters and made so many landings, like the one at Panuco, which need not be described in the Book of Mormon. Furthermore, Sahagun tells us that the original migrants under their first chief had traveled through the greater part of the world, and that those who landed in Mexico had traveled for 104 years through different parts of the world. If they had passed from the Near East into the valley northward across Asia and the Pacific, then traversed this continent to reach the Gulf Coast in Florida or at the mouth of the Mississippi, hence following the Gulf Coast to Mexico, this would certainly be true. On the other hand, a journey westward from Babylonia to the Mediterranean and out over the Atlantic does not take one through the greater part of the world and is far harder to visualize than the eastern route. I think it depends. So he's still making points saying that, look, there's two migrations that have been mentioned by these authors of information about the history. And I'm pulling up a map here. He's saying that it doesn't seem to fit what I'm thinking, that they come from this area. It's going to be the Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan area. So, this part of Asia, okay? And so, for him, first of all, he focused on the word Occidental, which apparently meant to the east, but they were using it as meaning to the west, because depending on your location, it's going to be one way or the other that's different from what he was normally used to. Okay, that's fine. But he's saying that they would have crossed the steppes of Asia through basically China to then do a Pacific crossing. And so he's making the idea that they made it all the way across and down into the Central American area. Whereas the group that's apparently about 104 years later said, well, we came from the Florida side and made our way along the coast down to kind of the Mexico area and territory. And so if that's the case, then couldn't they be the ones that were from it? He said they came from 7 caves. Could that have meant the 7 barges? So the problem is that there's kind of a lot of different conflicting views about where both the Jaredites and Lehi could have gone. So if you're someone who really is centered on Mesoamerica, the whole Yucatan Peninsula, lower part of Mexico area, you're perfectly happy with Hugh Nibley saying, yeah, it's probably down there, and they just came from the Pacific side, and other things like that. I get it. I'm cool with that. I tend to go to the Heartland area simply because it makes more sense to me with how the Book of Mormon has for Lehi and Nephi and the prophecies about coming to a land with no king and being a land of freedom and other things like that. And then the Hill of Cumorah being in upstate New York. And them talking about to see east, north, and west and how many days travel and journey. And I don't know, it seems to be, in my opinion, everywhere from the middle heartland of America, the Mississippi, if that's the River Sidon, and then you have the lakes that were up there and marshlands that were part of the lakes at that time. And the days traveling makes sense. So I have a lot that I have my own thoughts and reasons why I lean towards the heartland. I think it hit me because I grew up thinking about it being in the Mesoamerica area. In fact, I had a coworker a long time ago. We both worked nights, and he was way into the Mesoamerican area, and so he was really diving in on that, very much studying that, and he was thoroughly convinced. He was going through books that was pointing this all out and figuring it all out. And there's a lot of good points towards that. I agree. At the same time, there was a lot about it that didn't make sense to me as well. And you could say the same thing about either one of these places. So from what I'm reading from the author of Hugh Nibley is he's saying that the Mesoamerican area is their likely main cultural spot of being, followed by which they just ranged in wars all over the North American area, and that was the land of desolation. And because they ended up in upstate New York, or at least being destroyed up in the land of desolation, because for the Nephites and Lamanites, it was the land northward. Well, the land of northward is really big if you're taking all of the North American continent. Like, even on horseback, it's big. So, Hugh Nibley makes the points that, so what? Jaredites were used to having all of the Asiatic to wander. And, you think of the Mongol hordes, and how they had, their empire was from China through Europe. It was I'm getting my little factoids mixed up, I'm sure. So do not quote me on this. But if I remember right, it was Genghis Khan or one of the other Mongol hordes that had the largest empire that was ever created in the earth. And the only reason that we don't know more about it is because they didn't really keep their history throughout time very well. I mean, they could have, but then it's kind of been lost. So we learn about it through other means. So Hugh Nibley has an idea that spans much more of like all the Americas. Uh, I think a lot of Latter-day Saints nowadays tend to pare that down even further, only because of the time frames and distances that are mentioned in the Book of Mormon on the Nephite and Lamanite, Nephi-Lehi side, right? The this many days journey and these many mountains and these kind of problems. So I get it. There's good arguments for both sides of it being a localized area in Mesoamerica. There's certain things that make sense and kind of point to that. There's a lot of things there that I'm like, there's a lot of things that seem to be missing or don't make sense. And I know people have tried to explain it, but I'm like, yeah, that's not bad, but I don't think that that's good enough. But that's just my credulity on it. At the same time, when I heard about the Heartland of America kind of theory, at first I was like, what are these guys talking about? I don't get it. And they mentioned a few things, and I'm like, oh, really? And they mentioned all the things that I thought were missing in the Mesoamerican model. They're like, oh yeah, there's this right here and here and here, and here's these things, and there's all these things, and all these things that they complain about. Here's this information. So it seems to me they have a bunch of answers. Now, is theirs perfect either? Well, no, not entirely. I mean, they talk about having cement in the land northward of desolation. Well, if it's the heartland of America and the land northward, if the land of desolation is kind of the Great Lakes area, I've always thought of it as, well, I think that's a problem in my thinking, is because I grew up with the idea of, oh, it's going to be down in Mesoamerica, the land northward is desolate. So I'm thinking the southwestern United States and the northern part of Mexico, it's desert. It's not great out there. That's desolate to me, right? And I'm used to going to the Native American tribal spots out there, like Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde and other things like that. And there are places that you have descriptions of Quetzalcoatl there that match exactly Jesus Christ coming down and visiting. But Jesus Christ did a world tour after his resurrection. By all accounts, that's as one of the best ways I can think of it, is he just went to everyone he could who would be willing to listen. Because there's a lot of stories that seem to show that, hey, there's this white God that came down and taught the people and said he'd be back sometime. And there's like, I can't remember which islands it was. I can't remember if it was specifically the Hawaiians or others, but there's a couple of them where it's really like, really makes me think he did a world tour. So anyway, to me, I always thought the land northward desolation made sense, and that the whole cement thing in the land northward made sense because it's like, well, I'm used to these kind of ruins that had kind of adobe stuff put together to make things. At the same time, when I started thinking about, well, there's the Heartland model. How is it desolate to the north? Because I'm like, these places are marshy or they're wooded. They've got a lot of greenery. How is that desolate? And now that I think about the wars and stuff that they were talking about the desolation of the people. I mean, when you just walk across meadows and forests and other things like that, and there's just people's bones littered everywhere, yeah, that'd be pretty creepy, frankly, right? And so it can make sense. And apparently there is structures that were north of that. I have not been able to look into a ton of the claims of the Heartland model, but there was apparently settlements to the northward, so Great Lakes area, where they had cement. I don't know. I'm not great. So, again, you can have two different working models. You can poke holes in both, and you can support both, and we'll find out when we get there. But it is fascinating to me that I'm unraveling the idea that Hugh Nibley's conception of this is more of a Pan-American model, one where, sure, they may have been centrally located in middle to southern Mexico and Yucatan Peninsula area, but that their wars and fights were to land northward, which was reserved for hunting and fighting, etc. And that's where they became, the big wars spanning across all of America until they were decimated in the Northeast, where there was the land of desolation and such. So, I don't know, but it's kind of interesting. Read your Book of Mormon again, get those parts figured out for yourself. What do you think? All right, so then there is the second landing from Florida. The landing in Mexico is obviously the landing in Mexico is obviously one of the later developments of the Great Jaredite Migration, which we have often noted did not come from the end of their landing in the New World, but continued in many directions. We know that the Jaredites, in their wanderings, crossed many bodies of waters, and so made many landings like the one at Panuco, which need not be described in the Book of Mormon. Furthermore, Sahagun, and so he's basically saying, well, I subscribe to the idea that they came across Asia and are doing a Pacific crossing. And that's the main one. And so this other landing that kind of sounds like it came from Florida, just around the Gulf, always in sight, doesn't seem to fit with their Jaredite migration. And he's saying, see, this doesn't need to be a detail in the Book of Mormon. I agree with that, because remember, the Book of Ether was a summation of the history of the Jaredites through the prophet Ether. Later it was discovered by the people of Zarahemla, so the Mulekites, and specifically it was brought to Mosiah to help interpret. Okay? Fast forward several hundred years even after that, because again, Book of Omni, yes! You then have Mormon abridging everything, but it's Moroni who is handed this section to not only translate and abridge and put in. So it could have been a double abridgment. So we're getting like the main stories. Could it have had more? Maybe, maybe not. They talk about it only being 24 plates. And again, it being a hieroglyphic type language, I would expect that entire phrases and such are all really just crammed in to specific symbols. Dude, this should not be new or different or weird for anyone. If you get into advanced mathematics, think of the concept of an infinite summation, or you talk about doing integrals. One symbol in mathematics talks about an entire way of thinking and methodology for finding an answer and what you are doing in the realm of mathematics. And it's all contained in one frickin' symbol. So don't sit there and complain to me that, oh yeah, just 24 small plates and you can get the entire Book of Ether. It's like, yeah, you can. It's really not that hard. When you have one particular symbol that could be simply a dot or a dash, I don't know, I'm not into ancient languages, but it could be as simple as a couple of lines, and that means, and it came to pass. That's 5 words for just one simple symbol. And if that's just spread throughout, like it is in the Book of Mormon, you have this one little kind of thing, and you have an entire phrase. It's 5 times in the expansion compared to what it is in the original. So yeah, you easily could have a lot more on there than we know. That's the hard part. And I'm no expert in this by any means, but it just screams to me like that's a really bad argument to sit there and say, oh, well, the stuff, there's no way they could have expanded the Book of Mormon. They wouldn't have had room on the plates to write everything. They're not writing in English. They're not. Okay, so. So, here we go. The point I wanted to make originally was the idea that there's probably a bunch of history in Ether that's been abridged, and probably abridged twice. So when he talks about a minor migration from Florida back down to the central Mexico, doesn't need to be in there. Yeah, it's probably true. At the same time, it could also be the other way around. What if those the 7 caves that they came from, and they came from the Florida side versus the Pacific side? What if that was the Jaredites? And it just means that they weren't able to get all the information down about the other people who were prior here. Or, there's all sorts of ways you could look at it, and you could bolster your argument. So I'm just throwing my hat into the ring on that one, just to muddy the water a little bit. Let your own thinking run wild for a little while. Further, and I could be just blowing smoke simply because I am not a scholar like Hugh Nibley was. But anyway, furthermore, Sahagun tells us that the original migrants under their first chief had traveled throughout the greater part of the world. Let me just finish reading that. And that those who landed in Mexico had traveled 104 years through the different parts of the world, which is a long time, frankly. If they had passed from the Near East to the valley northward across Asia and the Pacific, then traversed this continent to reach the following, the Gulf Coast to Mexico, this would certainly be true. On the other hand, a journey westward from Babylon to the Mediterranean and out over the Atlantic does not seem like the greater part of the world and far harder to visualize than the eastern route. At the same time, they didn't know how big the world really was, or they don't make a strong indication that as such. For example, when they talk about Alexander the Great ruling the world, he talks about basically ruling his known portion of the world. So, I don't think this is a strong enough argument to convince me that it could be specifically one way or the other. I understand his persuasion that he wants it to be across Asia through China and the Pacific route, but it at the same time doesn't seem to necessarily rule out going westwardly either and going across the Atlantic. It doesn't quite rule it out. That's all I'm saying. In the writer's opinion, the most attractive interpretation of the evidence is this. From Babylon, at the time of the Great Dispersion, came a group of wanderers under their first king. They wandered through different parts of the world. That is important for our old world background. And then left Great Tartary, Asia, and crossed from Occidental parts to the New World, where they presently continued their exploration. Through 7. By land and water, one family or tribe of them, the Tamoanchan, coming cautiously down along the coast of the Gulf of Mexico to land over 100 years after the departure from the tower on the east coast of Mexico. Such a view is by no means the only possible one to be taken from Sahagun's evidence, but it seems to reconcile all the known facts, while the assumption that the original landing at Panko overlooks some important things, to wit. 1, the original settlers came to the New World from the west, not from the east. 2, that they apparently had been in Great Tartary, or Asia, east of the Caspian. 3, that they had traveled through many lands, though through most of the world, in fact. 4, that they were anxious to land, whereas the Panko people were coasting. 5, that the Mexican party are not said to have crossed the ocean on this occasion, a thing that would certainly have been recorded were it the case, but only to have come from the direction of Florida and from the north, which definitely localizes the picture, and above all, 6, that the landing at Panuco took place 104 years after the beginning of the Great Migration, whereas the Jaredites landed well within 1 generation after leaving the tower. The problem is a fascinating but not a vital one. The writer's opinion on the matter, excluded as he is from any deeper knowledge of the subject by an invincible ignorance of any of the native languages of Central America, must continue to be regarded as pure, unalloyed speculation. At best, a particle of truth, not an article of faith. And see, that's why this is another really good point. Both him and me were able to say, look, do we really have an idea? Obviously, Hugh Nibley has a lot more scholarship under his belt than I do. And even he is humble enough to say, I don't even really know, and this is speculation. Heck, if I wanted to add another thing of speculation. What if the whole Mesoamerican, Mexican ancestry of people were the Jaredites? And they did range all across America, but Lehi and Nephi and his brothers, all of them did come to the heartland of America. What if it's both? ¿Por qué no los dos? Right? Well, that would be interesting. I wonder if anyone's explored that. Appendix 2. So here we are, the very, very last little bit. How far to Cumorah? We brought this up earlier, since again, he has this kind of pan-American idea of the Jaredites. To Mr. Eugene L. Roberts and Mrs. Eldon Reed Clough in their fascinating book, Benjamin Clough, Provo, 1947, we are indebted for valuable chapters, 7 through 12. On the Brigham Young Academy expedition to South and Central America, in those pages the reader may find a clear answer to the question, what geographical barriers would definitely bar an army from passing from Central America to the North Country? The answer is none. Well, that was abrupt. Just kidding. On April 17th, 1900, a troop of 25 men with mules and wagons left Provo, Utah, with the purpose of seeking information casting light on the Book of Mormon in the lands to the south. Upon reaching the Mexican border, the expedition was disbanded, August 12th, 1900, by the order of general authorities, not because it had reached impassable terrain, but because of the expense involved in a large-scale operation. Proceeding into Mexico with a reduced force of 9 men and without wagons, the party found far easier and pleasanter going than they had in Arizona. Oaxaca they described as a very Eden, a hunter's paradise, though through which they were able to make 18 to 20 miles a day. Even the terribly rugged Sierra Madre Mountains were crossed in 3 weeks. Since the object of the expedition was to gather information, it moved very slowly. Each of the 9 men was a specialist, and each was allowed to do a thorough job. Thus, C. Van Buren made one of the finest collections of South American birds in the world. J.B. Fairbanks, frequently reminded at some camp or city to paint, and took long trips to the coast to ship his pictures back home. Clough and 3 others made one side trip of 400 miles to inspect the ruins of Palenque, and after passing Mexico City, the whole party climbed Popocatépetl. It was such activity rather than any terrors of the road that made progress slow. When in Guatemala, Professor Wolf dropped out, it was not because the going had become impossible, but because he had never liked the idea of marching beyond Nogales, and had been persuaded only with great difficulty to accompany the party as far as he did. Nowhere is the jungle described as an impenetrable barrier. There were always trails and ancient roads to follow. Swollen streams seemed to have presented the only serious obstacle to travel, yet they were all successfully crossed, and had the party not been unwise enough to attempt Central America during the rainy season, they could have been avoided almost entirely. When Brother Magleby fell sick in Salvador, all but Clough and Kainke stayed with him. At one time or another, every member of the expedition came down with fever, but all survived. Had Brothers Clough and Kainke been able to afford a 10-man escort, extremely moderate by explorers' standards, they would have made better time on their journey to Panama. As it was, they got through without serious mishap, and what delayed their entry into the city of Panama was not jungle, but a revolution, which also obliged them to go part of the way by boat. In Panama City, they were joined by other members of the expedition. So far were they from being downhearted. And then some of the men took the mules across the isthmus to Colon in only 3 days, though they had only uncertain and indefinite trails to follow. From Colon, the party went to Colombia by boat, solely because of Indian troubles, and not because of geographical obstacles. for the worst of the jungles and streams were already behind them. In Bogota, the expedition finally came to an end, not because the country had become impassable, but because the Colombian government advised them against proceeding further, since south of Bogota, the Americans would most likely have all their possessions confiscated by revolutionists before they had traveled far, and they would almost certainly be killed. Two aspects of Brigham Young Academy expedition are particularly pertinent to the question of the Book of Mormon logistics: the actual travel time of the party and the nature of the obstacles that slowed it down. As to the first, we subtract time taken off for missionary work, resting on the Sabbath, side trips, exploration, receiving the endless and exuberant hospitality of saints and natives along the way, a very demanding, time-consuming obligation. Caring for the sick, collecting, preparing, shipping specimens, negotiating for passports, duty exemptions, guides, etc. We find that the actual time on the road is to be measured rather in weeks than in months. If one chooses to stop off in Elko for 3 weeks on a trip from Salt Lake to San Francisco, one cannot rightly describe the journey as taking 3 weeks, and the explorers from Provo deliberately and constantly delayed on the road, even when actually underway. The group made no effort to move quickly, as to set a record for speed was yet one thing farthest from their thoughts. Yet, even with all these things to slow them to a crawl, the party reached the first narrow neck of land on February 16, 1901, less than 10 months after leaving Provo. Fully four of these months had been spent in Utah and Arizona, while more than a month more had been wasted in negotiations on the Mexican border. The second narrow neck was reached April 13, 1901, less than a year from Provo, and the narrowest neck of all was entered but 2 weeks later. It was a revolution that delayed the arrival at Panama City until the fall of the year. As to the nature of the obstacles, it will be readily seen that they are not such as any Jaredite or Lamanite army would have to cope with. Official delays, swollen streams, care for the sick, social obligations, ignorance of the country, hostile Indians, revolutions, lack of guides, lost and strayed pack animals, the labor of preparing scientific collections, such as hindrances could all be avoided by means and experience at the disposal of seasoned armies. The Brigham Young Academy expedition occasionally ran across to say such jungle ways would have been an infinitely better repair than in the days of old. The marching of armies would, in a very short time, establish a system of clearly marked and easily traveled strategic roads, and these would improve from year to year after each campaign. Though native troops adequately supplied with every means of accomplishing rapid forced marches could easily pass from the narrow neck of land to the North Country in a matter of days. In World War II, the Japanese demonstrated that the impenetrable jungles of Malaya, on which British strategy relied very heavily, were simply a myth. As Professor Spears pointed out in his book, Deserts on the March, there is no impenetrable jungles in nature. According to the famous military maxim of Suvorov, where a deer can go, a man can go, and where a man can go, an army can go. It has been proved time and again. The remarkable journey of the Brigham Young Academy expedition, made more than 50 years ago, is a very poorly equipped company during the rainy seasons through territories of hostile Indians and revolutionaries, proves that the Jaredite armies could easily have followed the old established pattern of making yearly raids of continental scope. So, the only question I would have on that section has more to do with what was their means of travel? Was it by car or was it just by donkey and walking? Because it was the 1900s, so could have just been by horses. Not sure. Does he mention that? I wonder if he did mention that at the beginning. A troop of 25 men with mules and wagons. So it was mules and wagons, and then when they got to Mexico, they ditched the wagons and half or more of the group. So just mules. So, maybe. He has a good point. The question comes down to what it is that they have for means of transport for both the Jaredites and otherwise. I think there's certain natural barriers that make things more difficult. Like if you are trying to get across the Grand Canyon, for example, that'd be annoying. It's not impossible by any means. In fact, there's the rim-to-rim-to-rim hikes that people will do, and there are mules that specifically go down into and out of the Grand Canyon. But it might be along the lines of, why bother? Because if you just look at a map, I mean, if the idea is that you are trying to fight and other things like that, the Grand Canyon is big, don't get me wrong, but it spans the northwest corner of Arizona. It is a huge scar of the land, but at the same time, you could go around it. And in fact, that's what the big roads that go through, just look around it. There is a road that goes from central Utah down to the right side of the Grand Canyon to Page. And so that's another road. It may not be this interstate that you're seeing in green, but you can tell that there's easy ways around it, and it's not exactly something that's going to stop you. So, okay, so they're talking about the different narrow necks of land, whether that's, getting down here. There's, pick a narrow neck of land. Do you want southern Mexico or between Guatemala and Nicaragua? Do you want Costa Rica, Panama? You figure it out. The funny thing though is how the Lamanites, Nephites and Lamanites talk about a sea north and a sea east and other things like that. It's like, which one are we talking about here? Because if you're in the Yucatan Peninsula, Guatemala area, you could say that what's the Gulf of America, Gulf of Mexico is the sea north, sea east is the Caribbean Sea, but sea south, sea west, well, to the west is land. You've got more of Mexico City and such, and I guess you could say it would be all of the Pacific, but go ahead. Whereas if you're, I don't know, there's like I said, there's a lot you can poke holes in the Mesoamerican model, and there's a lot of holes for the Heartlander model. And here, Hugh Nibley's concept is that they range from Central America and Panama and all that. It's the central connecting points of the American continents, all the way up through and across the northern land of the plains of America. And heck, if you're just going up north and to the east, and you've got plenty of time to travel, the Grand Canyon and all sorts of other things, heck, even the Colorado Mountain, the Rocky Mountains, don't even need to be that big of an obstacle. If you don't want it to be, just go around them. So, Yet at the same time, I sit here and think, how long did it take the Saints to have migrations from Illinois and Missouri and Iowa? Just the Council Bluffs and such is right here near the Platte River, near Omaha. And so you look on the west side of Iowa, and you go across Nebraska following that river. That's the Platte River. That's a kind of a freeway across the plains of Nebraska to get you to Wyoming and Colorado and such. And if you were going to the Oregon Trail, you'd follow up through Wyoming, through Idaho, to Oregon. But if you were the Saints, you'd cut down to go to where good old Utah and Salt Lake City is. So, yeah, it's really kind of funny. It would take months. It would take several months in wagons to get across. So I think the reason why members of the church talk about a narrower concept besides what Hugh Nibley had in mind, I think it's because of the time, the travel time. Whereas he's saying that, hey, if you look at this expedition where they just had mules and men in 1900, and they were going really slow, if you take all that extra crap out, you could probably be across from the narrow necks of land to the south, to the north, pretty darn quick. I throw my hands up. We'll find out when we get there. But I think it would be very fascinating to sit there and think, what if the Jaredites was Mesoamerica, but the Nephites and Lamanites were the Heartlanders? Why couldn't it be both? Something to think about, something to explore. I have no idea if anyone on Word Radio watches anything I do. It'd be hilarious if they did. And then just say, well, maybe they could do a whole episode on it being both. Never know. But anyways, that is the end of Lehi in the Desert and the World of the Jaredites. I'm going to start on A Marvelous Work and a Wonder, because there was two people that were interested in that, that had little messages for me. So I'll do that, and I'm actually going to start doing summaries, because apparently people viewed my shorts a lot better and faster than these long-form quick readings and musings. So I'll read chapters, do a summary, and hopefully more people will just listen, because I think overall just having commentary and talking and discussing ideas while reading brings it home, instead of it just being an audiobook you can throw out there. I mean, technically it's kind of like an audiobook, a lower quality in some ways, but I hope my additions of commentary help. Otherwise, I hope this was useful and helps uplift you and gives you things to think about. You don't have to settle on anything. You don't have to be in any one camp or another, but I hope it's helped you come to a realization of the reality of people in the Book of Mormon and the cultures that they came from, giving you a greater idea of, wait, what if it really was more along these lines? I know for me it enriches things a lot. And most of all, I hope it enriches your testimony and strengthens it. And may God be with you.